Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital builds some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools. We've enabled a lot of life science companies, pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device companies to virtualize their in-person meetings. These are actually things like virtual advisory boards, steering committees, medical education programs, investigator meetings, and even since COVID-19, we've been helping with things like brand plan rollouts, sales and MSL training, all done virtually. But more importantly than that, at Impetus Digital, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from a conversation, big, great ideas can transpire. And then we can start working together on some of these big, hairy, audacious, bleeding edge ideas, so that when we work with some of these provocateurs and people working on some leading edge ideas, concepts, leadership decisions, like the Brian Canestraros of the world, is that we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. And this is one of the purposes behind using and building this podcast and this YouTube channel so that we can start engaging and starting to do things differently in the healthcare space. So very happy and pleased to present somebody that we're going to be speaking today in this fireside chat, and that's Brian Canestraro. He is actually a very accomplished senior leader, and he's got an incredibly successful track record of business building and motivating teams to achieve exceptional results in all of the companies that he's worked in. He has over 20 years of top performance in innovative pharmaceutical industry. And he's got spanning several different material areas of commercial responsibility. He's currently the GM of Intercept Pharmaceuticals. And this is actually based in New York, although he's actually stationed in Toronto. And the company focuses on treatments for people with progressive non-viral liver disease. Before that, he actually spent over 9 years in various roles. He worked at Gilead as well as at Eli Lilly. He has a degree in kinesiology from Western University in our very own London, Ontario, and he has an MBA from the University of Leicester. So welcome. So happy to have you on the show, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and obviously the people following here remotely.
It's awesome. So we do always like to start off with our guests because they have such interesting, varied career trajectories. Tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you managed to land in such a great, amazing place as the GM of Intercept Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was good fortune, being at the right place at the right time. So you're right, I joined industry well over 20 years ago, and it doesn't feel like 20 years, it's gone by pretty quickly. But I was able to join industry at a time when we were at the leading edge of the former blockbuster era. So a number of companies at that time were hiring people, and I came straight out of Western kinesiology degree and found myself lucky enough to be in a sales role at that time at a small company named Zeneca, and spent a few years between Zeneca going to GlaxoSmithKline and then later on Lilly. So that tour from small to sort of large and then medium-sized pharma company. And I think at Lilly, I really fell in love with the specialty business unit. That was the first time that we got into biologics. The first time that you realized that you could be as close to the customer and the patient as you could, and really delivering life-saving, transformative therapies. And so for me, that was a real game changer. I think I found the lane that I wanted to be in for a very long time. After that, was very lucky to join Gilead Sciences back in 2005. At that time, I was part of the first handful of employees as Gilead was building out in Canada. And I think in our first year of business, we did about $17 million. And almost a decade later, I remember leaving the organization with well over $1 billion in revenue and somewhere in the range of 100 employees. And so for me, looking back on my career, that was a remarkable professional gift because of just the development, the change that happens, and what you learn through going through a company that's sort of undertaking that kind of trajectory and growth and offering products to patients in very topical and important disease areas. And then, shortly after that, about 5.5 years ago, I decided to come over to Intercept, and and really sort of take all the experience that I had and build something from scratch. And so, I've been involved in not only the build as employee number one, but the ongoing leadership of Intercept's operations here in Canada. And we operate in what is known as more of an enterprise model. So from my perspective, the Canadian operations encompass commercial delivery, medical affairs, regulatory, legal, and compliance, all of the important aspects of bringing important therapeutics to Canadians across the country. So it's been a really interesting, informative, but also rewarding 20 plus years in industry.
Wow, and it sounds incredibly interesting. And I'm just going to linger there for a few minutes because we obviously realize since the COVID-19 pandemic that the world has changed into a place in some ways that's even unrecognizable. And I think that certainly has affected the pharmaceutical industry equally. So spending a couple of minutes thinking about those past 20 years and being a sales rep 20 years ago, and then fast forwarding into the hashtag new normal. What do you see as being some of the fundamental differences about what it meant to be a sales representative for the life sciences space back in the day? And what do you think it means today representing a company?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think, back in the day, and people who've been around long enough would remember that our model was much more about share of voice and these important, dimensions around reach and frequency that we would constantly monitor. And it was more of an activity-based role. And I think for a lot of people like myself that remember that time, it wasn't as fulfilling as the role is now today. I think today the role of a sales rep pre-COVID was much more about being a value broker to the diversity of offerings that any company was bringing to an HCP that could help, improve the lives of patients. I think now what we've learned in the last 6-7 months through COVID, and quite frankly, I've been incredibly impressed with the resilience of my team and how quickly we pivoted. And I think pivot is the right word. I think we weren't on a natural evolution to change. Industry is not, very rapid in terms of changing. So while the science looks incredible and is innovative, we probably haven't followed along in terms of commercial execution in lockstep with that. But what has changed in the last 6-7 months, at least from my sales team's perspective, is it looks like a much more B2B capability. So HCPs still see value in interacting with industry, but how we deliver that value is different. Clearly, it's much more remote. You are depending less on a relationship. You're taking what could have been a 30-40 minute exchange, and you're now trying to truncate that into maybe a 5-10 minute Zoom call. But all the while, the physician is looking for value. So from my perspective, there are probably 3 things that have changed. I think the first thing is, it's going to be important to recognize that this remote world demands a higher level of insights generation, because if you want to create, content that's meaningful to customers, you're going to have to do that in a way that's based on meeting their needs and understanding what their needs are. The second thing is it puts a really high bar against content creation. Content will be king, but importantly, differentiated content that adds value and that can be pulsed and offered consistently is going to be really important in a world where we're increasingly remote. And I think the third thing is when you start to translate the insights and the content, it puts a greater emphasis on collaboration. So whereas before you might have a specialty rep collaborating a lot with a medical affairs MSL and potentially a PSP program, now you're adding perhaps a marketer and a BI person in the mix to start triangulating all of that data to think about how do we start to now think about more bespoke delivery of our offerings. So I think of the rep still as being a quarterback in terms of the value offering, but it looks much more B2B in this world than it maybe did pre-COVID.
Right. Absolutely. And I think part of that question also comes down to is we just look at the general makeup of the way the traditional pharmaceutical infrastructure worked on in the commercial side. So there was obviously sales and marketing, but what about the medical space? Has the profile of medical affairs, scientific affairs, has that changed and modified? Is it expanding? Is it in par with the traditional appendage, which has always been, sales and marketing being the kind of the main focus, the main scope? What does that look like in today's market?
Yeah, I think in having gone through this and building out an organization, you think about what are the first types of people that you bring into a company. What are the most important resources that you add at different life cycles and stages of the company? And medical affairs is now, it's table stakes. It's a core enabling capability. So from my perspective, I think the regulatory affairs and function is critical. It's so important. I think that we're seeing an increased dependence and importance on medical affairs as a key enabling function. It's hard to imagine any company realizing any semblance of success without strong capability and market access. And this is all with the notion of what has really changed, at least in my mind, in the last 7-8 years in industry, and that is this need to defend and support your product profile throughout the life cycle of its IP. So way back when, you would have launched a product based on regulatory P3 data. You may have engaged in phase 4 data to help round out the product profile. You went through an HTA process, you negotiated with the payers, and it got listed. Today, that still happens, but I think that there is more pressure on companies with more competitive introductions of other therapies looking to displace that agent, that you really have to be on your toes and think about defending the value of that product throughout the life cycle. So for me, it puts a lot of emphasis on medical affairs, both prior to launch, during the launch, and obviously throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, so important that all of these different dimensions that we have to think and consider differently. You also mentioned the importance about insights. And, I guess in some ways we can really sort of have the discussion that data is the new oil of today. It is the powerhouse. It's really, quite frankly, it's what's generated the gigantic growth in some of the big, large companies like the Amazons and the Googles, because they really rely on data, et cetera. So what does that look like in the pharmaceutical space? How were we capturing data prior to COVID? And what does data look like today? Does it look different? Has it increased in scope? Is it qualitatively different? And is the mechanisms in which we're capturing, is there new vehicles that we're using?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, data looks different and quite frankly is different. I think the information points and where we're pulling in information from to give rise to insights is all over the place, quite frankly. So in years gone by, you probably would have bought IMS TSA data, and it would have given you line of sight to what's happening at the retail outlet level. It might have given you some line of sight to maybe lagging indicators of how people were prescribing and thinking about your product. In today's sort of day and age, the way that we look at data, and we're a smaller to mid-sized company, so it certainly isn't a reflection of maybe how larger companies with more resources are doing this. But there is a remarkable amount of richness in our patient support program that is just in time in many respects. But if you think thoughtfully through, what are the questions that I want to be asking 6 months after launch? What are some of the questions that I want to be able to answer a year to 5 years post-launch? It helps you build a data set and an archetype for capturing data that's going to add value throughout the life cycle. So from our perspective, the PSP is a rich repository of information. The other area where we're capturing data and really is more towards the lines of being patient-centric and having a window into the world in terms of how the patient is thinking and how their thinking is driving behavior is through partnerships with patient associations. There are a number of patient associations that have built capability now in their own form of insight generation, whether it be through surveys, through educations, through different pulsing of pieces of market research that give us a different layer of thinking about, what is the journey of the patient and how do we have to think about more, more bespoke ways of delivering our offerings. I think the third thing that we've done is try to find a overlap in the Venn diagram between the patient association and our own data sets, which is to say, we have a cohort of patients in our patient support program that have experience with our company, experience with our product. How do we reach into that in a compliant way, of course, and try to understand what parts of the value offering are more valued and which parts of our value offering can we look to improve. We've done that a lot in the COVID era, and we've learned quite a bit about how our patients have responded to COVID, some of their perceptions early days around telehealth, some of the evolving needs now that they have a much more remote relationship with their HCP than maybe they did before. So it's a long way of saying that data exists everywhere. And I didn't touch on registries, but we do quite a lot of work in terms of supporting our medical community. So we're primarily in the hepatology gastroenterology space, but the registries give us a really nice line of sight to what's happening in the real world. So your clinical trial is taking place in a somewhat perfect fishbowl. Patients are seen. There's a comprehensive team that's overseeing their care. They're compliant, and then that gives rise to results. The question becomes, is that the same kind of result that you can expect in the real world? And of course, we look to registries and prospectively understanding that so that we can make sure that the product profile and the value offering is delivering what it's supposed to in the real world as it did in the clinical trial environment.
So really important nuggets, and there's just so much variety out there, and it ultimately comes down to is what is going to be your core metrics, what is going to drive the business. And like you said, data can come from everywhere. At the end of the day, it comes down to the ability to refine the oil or refine the data and be able to use it in a way that's going to propel the business. So I'm just going to take a step backwards and kind of go through a hypothetical pharmaceutical company just coming into the market. The lifeblood behind any manufacturer just kind of coming in is really around the discovery and identification of new entities. So part of that process is clinical studies. I mean, we're going through that right now with COVID-19. Yes, everybody wants a vaccine, but we have to go through the due diligence of phase 2s and well thought through phase 3s and capturing real world evidence, et cetera. So my question to you is, in this new world of teleconsults, telemedicine, social distancing, not being able to leverage the standard tried and tested ways of clinical research organizations, and on the list goes, a legacy infrastructure that has worked for pharma for so many years may have actually exploded and potentially paved the way for new and exciting ways of doing things. How would a company coming into this start to think about how to do clinical studies if you were to give advice on how they would position the start of a clinical study?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think they're while the commercial model is changing and how we're thinking about patient engagement is changing, and while that patient-physician dynamic is changing, so too will clinical trial design and deployment. I'm certainly not the expert to talk to in terms of what does a good clinical trial look like and how do I think that's going to evolve. But what I can say is, at least from the outside looking in, it's remarkable to see how quickly a number of companies have retooled and worked within their own organizations as well as their CROs to find ways to remotely remain in contact with existing patients enrolled in studies to ensure continuity of clinical trial enrollment, deployment, and GCP. And at the same time, I think companies are going to learn a lot about how can I redesign a study going forward, and how might I do it differently now that I have the experience of knowing that remote and quite frankly works quite well most of the time. What we don't know is, can trials be done quicker? Can they be done more efficiently? Can they be done at a lesser cost? Time will tell. But I think that the upfront work around probably protocol design, getting CTAs approved, the process of any CTA amendments, I think that is still going to be important. Regulatory process that maybe won't evolve significantly, but in terms of how you make that happen operationally, certainly that will likely change, as have commercial operations and other elements of business.
We really talk a lot in the pharma business around customer centricity. I think that language started several years ago. I believe that some companies probably just mentioned it, weren't really entertaining it per se. But I think since COVID-19, I think it's become almost a matter of how to do business. So just lingering or double clicking a little bit more on that whole getting into the space, starting clinical studies and getting robust enough information around a product to bring it to market. How do you sort of foresee the involvement of patients at the clinical trial level when they maybe, for example, are not ready for that 40-page consent to receive and then suddenly having to sign up, and it's just more difficult to get people trained, involved. How do you sort of foresee patients and that patient-centric model getting involved as early as the clinical trial startup?
Yeah, it's hard to speculate. What I can talk to is patient centricity and what I'm seeing from patient groups that we engage with. So first, I'm a believer in patient centricity. And what I know now from many years of experience is it's an easier thing to say than it is to do. It does require a lot of effort, and you need to be open-minded to the fact that if you're seeking patient feedback, patients are offering that on behalf of you, knowing that you're probably going to take some action on that. And so I think that what you have to be open to is realizing that patient groups may tell you something different than you believe, and that it may change your plans, but you have to be open-minded enough to think about how are my plans going to change, because that's important feedback. And I think that if you follow the patient and you follow the needs of the patient throughout that journey, everything else will follow, because it will have been the right decision and your business will follow that. In terms of patient contributions to clinical studies and research, I think there's a huge treasure trove of value that can be sought here. I think, early days, we see the value of patient input into HTA processes and adding an entirely different dimension and level of appreciation for a therapeutic, or the espousal of the value judgment on a therapeutic. And I also think that there's value in terms of patients being involved in not only clinical trial design, but thinking about how do you deliver clinical trials in a way that sort of fits into the patient journey and maybe measures dimensions of how patients experience a disease that are maybe less clinical, but augment the clinical picture that you would use to benchmark efficacy against.
Yeah, I love that thinking, and it's absolutely essential. And I think it's a great way to view the inclusion of patients, even right from the get-go, of is this even a worthwhile product, service, et cetera, of even endeavoring in. I know I'm kind of getting sort of technical digital here, but some of the things that we're hearing, being on the digital side of things, is getting patients involved with things like patient-reported outcomes, electronic consent to doing studies, using their wearables, and entry into using things like patient portals directly into the studies, and having these sort of being involved with progress reports and all these things through, GDPR and sort of HIPAA compliant platforms. But is this a reality that you think is going to come sooner than later? And if so, are we set up, for example, in Canada with the right regulatory environment to enable this in a very efficient way?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm certainly not a clinical trial expert, but I think that if we think about the lens of privacy considerations, GDPR, the reality is most studies don't initiate, originate, get developed from start to finish in Canada. So obviously there are considerations in terms of information transfer, whether that's going south of the border to the United States or across the Atlantic into a European destination. So I think that there's probably a lot of consideration that has to happen in terms of privacy, GDPR, to enable that kind of approach and sort of inclusivity of the patient considerations in clinical trial design, folding into PROs, looking at other dimensions of efficacy. I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. I think that subject matter experts in the space should contemplate that, because I believe at the end of the day that there's another value dimension that we're not fully appreciating right now.
Yeah, for sure. So moving along the kind of the life cycle, if you will, of this brand, from clinical studies into the foray of kind of coming into the market, there is this whole question around who has access to this amazing, wonderful new entity, this new, this new discovery. This ultimately always ends up being the question around access and who has access and process around that. Where does the patient and or the physician come into that value discussion, or how should it be in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's where I've spent, probably the last 10 years of my career in market access and thinking about how do we, redefine our value story so that we're delivering access that is sufficiently broad and timely so that patients can benefit as much as possible. And from my perspective, a lot of good things have happened. I think first and foremost, my experience has been that despite how people may or may not think, people in government, people on the payer side, frequently want what we want for patients. I think that we're always coming, we're always coming to the same conclusion that patients will need some form of access, and we're working together to make that happen. A number of important things have happened in the last, I think, 5-6 years that help to enable other voices. So I talked earlier about, some of the work that CADTH has done to enable patient input. And that is a process that has evolved from start to current day. At start, it was pretty simple, pretty basic. You could look at a lot of the CDEC reports and summary reports and come to a conclusion that perhaps the value and the input of the patient wasn't fully considered in terms of making a recommendation on a product. But I think today you look at the quality of the submissions, the evidence base that patient groups are putting into this. I think the receptivity that HTAs are demonstrating. The voice of the patient is much better integrated into the access decision today than it probably ever has been in Canada. And at the same time, what has been missing until recently has been the voice of the clinician. And typically the voice of the clinician may have been, a consultative voice as you as a manufacturer building out your file for submission to CDR and S and the private payers. And perhaps after the fact, if you were thinking about how do you improve reimbursement once that's landed at the provincial level following the contracting process. But just recently, the CDR has introduced a new process where physician associations, medical associations can play a role in a formal part of the HTA review. And I think that that's going to be an important additional layer because now you have the manufacturer's position, you have the voice of the patient, and importantly, you have the voice of the clinician. So I think that we're in a position today where more important voices are coloring how people around that HTA table are espousing a value judgment on any therapeutic.
Yeah, so really, really great thoughts, and I love that there's some really positive movement, if you will. Even though sometimes things feel like they're falling apart or they're crumbling, there's always rhyme and reason, and there's a silver lining behind all those changes. This actually also brings us to the question of regulatory agencies. So obviously in Canada, it's Health Canada. I think there's always a traditional way, methodology, timing that we have become very accustomed to. And again, I keep using the pandemic as that inflection point, but it really has been an accelerant of pivotal change across the board in healthcare. Is it also has really kind of pushed the limits on Health Canada. So for example, we see recently a lot of push on them and a lot of scrutiny on, for example, approvals of COVID-19 rapid testing and why is this not happening faster and what are these people doing? And there's been a lot of focus on it. So I guess my question to you is this a good thing, Brian? Is this healthy? Do you think that the COVID-19 example is an opportunity to really look deep at the mechanisms that we've created at a national level, and maybe potentially some reforms and some opportunities to change? And if so, what would we want to ultimately see with some of this regulatory structure that we've built in Canada?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think the first thing that I would say is that what I've learned, what we've hopefully learned through COVID as an industry and as a diverse group of stakeholders is that when we share a common goal, we can make things and the right things happen pretty quickly for patients. And so, a few examples that I can think about top of mind really are, early days there was supply chain strain in the system that was generated as a result of COVID. Very quickly, government and payers worked to say, we will not dispense more than 30 days of supply in an effort to make sure there's continuity of supply chain, that anybody who needed a therapeutic could have access to that therapeutic. Shortly after that, this has been a very long dialogue that hasn't been successful until recently, but shortly after that, almost every single province introduced a billing code to enable telemedicine. That I think was fundamental in providing access for patients to their physicians. And then, of course, if we think about the operationalization of access and the importance of continuity of therapy, we also saw that a number of private payers, but also public formularies, lessened and lowered the bar in terms of prescription renewal, so that if you were coming up to a 6-monthly, a 12-monthly need for renewal and the paperwork that followed that, that was eliminated. And I think that those were all important and responsive, purposeful things that enabled continuity of care and that were very patient-centric in nature. It's a long way of saying that's episodic and that worked well. And there are other examples of work that have been happening in Health Canada for quite some time. And I think about some of the recent modernization that Health Canada has undergone. And so even prior to the modernization, Health Canada has come a long way in terms of the quality and the speed and what they do on behalf of Canadians and looking at efficacy, safety, quality. I still run into people that had an experience with Health Canada 20 years ago that are almost wounded by how long it would take for review, how often a KPI might fall off track. But the reality is, if you think about the last 15 years of Health Canada, remarkably modernized, adherence to KPIs that is 99+%, and they do a fantastic job as an independent regulator to look at safety, quality, and efficacy. But they haven't stopped there. They've introduced the R2D2 program. And really, I think R2D2 was really interesting because it was built in the spirit of finding ways to accelerate access of therapeutics to patients. So what you're essentially enabling here is greater consistency and a shorter timeline from the start of a regulatory process to hopefully an approval or a notice of compliance with conditions approval. But at the same time, it enabled a parallel submission to HTAs. So essentially, that uncoupled HTA regulatory pathway has now been harmonized, and it should theoretically offer sooner access to patients. I think those are all good and worthwhile, noteworthy things. But at the same time, you can't look at that and think about how wonderful and opportunistic that is for patients, and reflect on the fact that you have the same agency that is undertaking work under the PMPRB, which is going to likely delay and in many cases prevent a number of important innovative therapeutics from coming to Canada. So on one hand, you have this remarkable modernization and this effort to accelerate the delivery of products into Canada that isn't marrying well with, will these products even come because of pricing benchmarks and the reality that we live and exist in a global world, and Canada is a small part of the global world that other markets reference. And of course, why would you put larger markets at risk? And that is an important consideration that I think has fallen a little bit off the radar screen of some of the people making decisions.
I think in addition to what you were saying is, Health Canada and new pivotal things like software as a medical device, starting to incorporate that. We've seen, of course, the FDA working on having a whole division on digital therapeutics and Canada following suit. So it's a very interesting space, but I do love how you brought up one of the other key issues is we're now in this mashup of people in various, places in their own trajectory and level of change, all in this mashup. And we're trying to sort of sort where we are in that place. And one of the questions comes down to, in Canada, the PMPRB, and the whole question around national pharmacare and the all-arching question around pricing. As you were mentioning, Canada is a very small piece of the overall global puzzle, and the global decisions around product launches and who goes where and what time is something going in. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on where we are as a country on pricing, what's the good what's the bad, what are some of the things that we really need to think really carefully through in order for us to make sure that the best medicines are accessible by the most patients.
It's such a complicated topic, and certainly would need a lot more time than on today's discussion and podcast. And I think, for me, I reflect on a few different things. I think one is this catch-all phrase that we use to say pricing. And I think it's important for us to reflect and think about, when we are talking about pricing, are we talking about the pricing of innovative therapeutics? Are we thinking about the pricing of generic multi-source products? Are we thinking about the components of pricing in terms of list price to distribution and markup at the different sort of provincial and private payer levels based on allowable allowances? So the pricing conversation in and of itself is a real tempest in a teapot. But what I can say from the innovative perspective is prior to the recent dialogue around PMPRB, if I go back to maybe 2015, 16, what I would have said to my organization, any organization at that time, because we are looking at launches through a much more global lens, is that the Canadian environment, while complex, offers some semblance of predictability in terms of list price. And we have a really unique marketplace that is, in many ways like a global petri dish. And that's typically the way that I like to describe it, where you have, a significant proportion of Canadians that access medications through third-party, privately insured plans of 26 million Canadians. And that's not an insignificant number of people that are able to access their therapeutics in a much faster, much more broad manner than Canadians that depend on the public side of our payer mix, which is also very important. But they're very different markets. So on the private side, that is a competitive, for-profit dynamic that looks very different. And there are thousands of different permutations of plan design. And so we can't look at these two different entities through the same lens. And I think frequently we try to do that. Because on the public side, the reality is these are government programs that are working within a fixed envelope of funding to deliver products to patients who need that. And they're doing that through a different value lens and a different economic lens. And it is complex to anybody from the outside looking in. But at the same time, 2015, 16 and prior, we had enough predictability in the list pricing market for companies to come to Canada. And there was enough wherewithal for us within industry to work within the different dynamics on the private and public side to make sure that patients, Canadians across the country, could benefit from the important innovation in therapeutics that were coming out of labs around the world. And that is largely why Canada has historically been a tier 1, tier 2 launch country. And I think very quickly we're seeing through all the surveys and all the empiric evidence that's been mounting in the last couple of years, and even just directionally observing what's happening in terms of just HTA submissions and filings to Health Canada, that when you remove that sense of predictability and you realize that we exist in a global world, there isn't an appetite for people making decisions outside of Canada to rush any decisions in terms of bringing innovation to Canada. And I'm hopeful that the last year and a half's worth of evidence points tells people who are seeing these decisions that first and foremost, Canada is important. We've learned a lot through COVID in terms of the valuation of healthcare, the importance of therapeutics, and that we wouldn't want to do anything that undermines a Canadian's ability to access therapeutics. Because if we are, a G7 nation with the wherewithal that wants to contribute globally on a number of different stages, why wouldn't we want to offer that same level of innovation to people in the country that pay taxes and need that innovation? So it's a long way of saying it's a complex conversation that I think there's still a window for optimism, but I think it takes parties to come together with a shared sense of what good looks like. And I think that we can get there with industry and government.
I think that you said that beautifully, Brian, and that the private and the public systems are completely different entities and need to be dealt with appropriately. But it does beg the question about what is currently happening in the healthcare space, both positive and negative. Certainly, COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of life science companies, pharmaceutical companies. They've become almost a bit of like heroes in this tragic story. So there's been some positive light there. At the same time, the tragedy is that there just isn't enough money in the public system. We can actually just look across our boundaries over at Alberta, where they're actually laying off thousands of hospital workers and healthcare workers. We are hearing a lot of the, various premiers of, talking about how they think that the model where the provinces are the ones responsible for healthcare, that they're just basically suffocating and they're just getting swallowed up. And perhaps this is a time to be starting to talk about the model of how the federal government may need to start getting involved in the healthcare equation. Is this an opportunity for life science companies more at a governmental level to get engaged in the conversation? What is your personal, and again, it's not Intercept Pharmaceuticals' opinion, but what is your thoughts on how things should change based on the fact that if we don't, we're looking at some pretty difficult days ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a chunky topic, right? And there was a quote, and I won't affix it to a name because I'm sure I'm going to have the originator of that wrong. But there's a quote that says, "If you show me your budget, I'll show you what you value." So I think in many respects, what we've learned through COVID is that as a society, as a community of people, we value healthcare. Yeah, we recognize the importance of it. When it's not there, we realize how much we value it even more. And so I think it goes without saying that I think that Canadians in general and people in government, want to do the right thing. And the challenge is, as you rightly point out, that and it's one of my concerns as well, is if you look at any province or even at the federal level, the economic outlook is going to look very different following COVID. For example, we've seen, I think, in some provinces like British Columbia, where you had a $400 million surplus that you're projecting for the fiscal year, that is rapidly projecting to become a $12 billion deficit. And other provinces are following that kind of pattern with different magnitudes of debt load, of course. And so it does beg the question of, how do we do this, and how do we rethink how we deliver healthcare in a more efficient way, because we recognize that we value it. And I think that, for me, independently, to bring forward a recommendation or an answer, I'm never going to have all the answers. It's such a complex problem. But at the same time, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is this siloing of budget, siloing of responsibility, and that siloing doesn't tend to be purposeful. And in many respects, I think if we can look at deconstructing the way that healthcare is delivered and realizing that, a dollar spent in one area of the healthcare system is not disconnected to a dollar spent in another. I mean, it's remarkably integrated. And healthcare is also an important determinant of other dimensions of quality of life, economic or otherwise, right? So I think for us to look blindly at healthcare in a bubble and to create sub-bubbles of that is the wrong thing to do. I think we just need to come together and figure out, what do we value? Does our budget reflect what we value? And then how are we thinking about playing a more active role in bringing new and innovative technologies to the marketplace, thinking about how we're being more intentional about bringing that to patients as opposed to erecting barriers, and measure what can happen. I think good things can happen if we're all working on the same side. But it's a big chunky topic that's worth having with a broader and more diverse group of stakeholders.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And it ultimately comes down to relationships, and it comes down to idea generation and, a series of iterative ideas until we can reach some positions and some consensus on it, but definitely a longitudinal process. You mentioned earlier about the idea around content and the way this is actually being reformatted, rethought in the new normal, how we actually manage content. We're now living in a world of digital. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how information and data is being conveyed to patients, payers, allied healthcare providers, platforms and otherwise. What is content generation and receptivity and kind of the back and forth look like in this new world to you?
To me, it's been a remarkable surprise. So I think, like every company in the space, once you had a chance to sort of reflect and digest the events of mid-March, when we pulled people out of field and we sent people to work from home, the next decision was, how do we reimagine, rethink the way that we're reaching customers? And the way that we had described our approach to COVID early days was, in order of priority, these are the most important things. One is the well-being of yourself and your family. That is, top of mind for us as an organization, and as a leader, that was important to me. The second thing is that we demonstrate the right level of respect and respectfulness for people in the healthcare system. They're about to embark on what is going to be a very exhausting and challenging journey, and they need all of our support. And then the third thing is just maintaining some sense of business continuity to the patients that we were presently serving. And that lasted for a while. And then you realize that there's a whole cohort of people that are suffering that don't have COVID. And so, rightly so, you had to ask yourself the question of, is the fallout of people with chronic disease and other conditions not being able to access care going to be the same or a larger consequence than COVID? And so, of course, we had to rethink about, okay, we have a duty to these patients and our healthcare professionals to continue to add value and reach them. And so, for us, we pivoted quickly and we did three things. First and foremost, we built a framework to understand our HCP receptivity to engagement. So clearly it wasn't face-to-face, but tell us about your preferences: email, phone, video call, webinar. Help us understand at least the milieu of offerings that we could contemplate putting together for you and how receptive you might be. The second thing is we realized that we had to get to the digital enablement stage very quickly. Rebuild content for remote delivery, create new content in formats that supported remote delivery, and actually sign up to start building and owning some of the important infrastructure elements to deliver that content against. And the third thing, and not least important, certainly it was critical, was retooling and building competency across our organization and getting comfortable with digital. How this interface looks, how we need to evolve to have an impact, and how to recognize that we're not going to be perfect overnight. This is going to be a long-term journey. And so I'm really excited, pleased, and surprised, quite frankly, at how well this has worked, how receptive our customers have been, how real these formats feel. And one of my pain points, and the team no longer refers to activities in this way, at least in our affiliate anymore, was this notion that we're having a virtual engagement or a virtual ad board or having a virtual touch point with a customer, because having been on these, they're very real. The exchange is real, the dialogue is real, the emotions are real, the takeaways are real. And to me, it's been surprising at how normalized this type of back and forth has become in a short period of time. And so for us, this is now going to become part of our new normal. So eventually we will get to a future state. I don't think it'll ever look like it did pre-COVID, but I think that digital will be an important capability that is here to stay. And for us, the most important things going forward is realizing, in a world where everybody has pivoted to digital and customers still only have so many hours in a day, it's going to be more important than ever to create content that is A, meaningful, that is B, digestible on the customer's terms, when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, and to make sure that we're always in front of understanding the customer's needs so that we can continue to refine the process. So we don't want to land in any future state today because I think it's going to be an evolving future state, but I'm really encouraged with how receptive and effective this has been.
I love how you reframed virtual, because I think if COVID has taught us anything, especially in the mirage of what I call the demagogues and all kinds of things that are going on in the uprisings, is that there's multiple realities for everybody, and they're all somewhat true for everybody who thinks of them. So it also, I think, speaks sort of existentially to this idea of what is virtual versus what is real. It does bring one to the question of the new workplace. And, for Intercept or for others, I'm sure this has all been part of very diligently of conversation and of rethinking and the reimagining of what the pharmaceutical company looks like. Is it an actual local place, or is it a series of minds and ideas and hearts of people with a very specific vision? And the reason for the question is, obviously, there's a new way. I mean, you hear about the Jack Dorseys who are saying to Twitter employees, you can work remotely for the rest of your life, to other people like Netflix as an example. They've talked about, well, we can't wait till we get back to the office, and then there's everything in between. So what does that look like? But then on top of that question is the question of what is local versus what is global? Is there still a need for a local affiliate when suddenly you have an opportunity with these various platforms for a one-to-many conversation with whoever that resident expert is? And this applies, by the way, in the field of medicine with physicians as well, is that, what does that look like? Is there still a need for local versus global? And what does the new pharmaceutical company look like?
It's such a provocative question, right? Because I think we're still in the middle of the change. What I can say is that in the 6-7 months that we have been more remote in terms of operations, it's remarkable to think about how effective we can be. And in many respects, a lot of the smaller organizations and even the larger organizations were becoming more decentralized in nature, working more collaboratively across functions, across teams, across geographies. And so that is the same even here. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of value that you can have by bringing more diversity of experience, diversity of opinion, diversity of skill set to surround any problem or activity. I think that's something that we had done, I think, reasonably well prior to COVID, but we've certainly taken more advantage of in the COVID era. In terms of what that means in terms of programming going forward, it's too hard to tell. What I can say from our local experience, at least, is it's changed the way that we think about the notion of territory. And so early days, and even in the earlier COVID days, a lot of our field-based teams would be delivering educational content by way of webinar to their HCPs in their sort of territory. And what you start to realize when you open your mind is that, why are we putting a geographic boundary around an educational interaction, an interaction that allows for collaboration? So all of a sudden, coming back to the insights and the importance of collaboration, wouldn't it be incredible if you can take a number of like-minded, like-behaving customers, regardless of where they locate geographically, and create a value-added forum for their education and engagement? How does that change things? How does that make you rethink the way that you're thinking about territory? So in many respects, I think that the boundaries are becoming blurred. I think that there is value in terms of recognizing that those boundaries are being blurred, and that where you can, I think you set yourself up for a much better customer experience and a much better ability to enable improved patient care by bringing a diversity of opinion and experience together. So, we're on the beginning part of that journey. What that looks like a year from now, 5 years from now, I don't know, but I'd like to think that it looks different than it did pre-COVID.
I love it. This is a rapid fire question. So off the top of your head, What are you most concerned about in the future, and what are you most excited about?
Ooh, okay. Oh, what am I most concerned about? I would be lying if I didn't say that I still had a significant amount of concern around PMPRB and the way that some people in different parts of either government or academia view industry. I've been in industry well over 20 years, and I can tell you hand on heart that we have some of the most dedicated, passionate, above board, committed people that spend a lot of their time and effort, working hard to improve the health care for patients across the country. Because on one hand, it's what they and we are driven to do, and on the other hand, we're also recipients of that same healthcare system. So why wouldn't we want to seek improvement for your friend, your family member, my friends, my family members? We're all part of this community, and I hope that more people looking at these decisions see it in that way and through that light. So a long way of saying I'm still a bit concerned about some of the adversarial opinions and just the visceral nature of how some people look at industry. What excites me is everything that's happening in the labs these days. You could argue that it has never been a better time to be a patient, because the pace of science, the quality of science, what that is doing, for the optimism and the outcome of patients has never been better. If I think about even our strategic network of partners here in Canada, looking at patient support programming and the vertical integration that space has gone through, and the quality of how we're overlaying telemedicine, laboratory, diagnostic, other elements that service offering, it is a very good time to be a patient in Canada, because companies are doing a great job of bringing innovation to Canada. Strategic partners are improving their offerings, and it's all with a line of sight towards creating a fantastic experience for patients that will give rise to the opportunity for the best health outcomes possible. So how can I not be optimistic when I think about it through that lens?
I absolutely love it, and what a great hopeful note. Brian, you are just a wealth of interesting ideas, insights. I could literally speak to you for hours on any of these given topics, so we'll have to reserve that for another time. But so absolutely enjoyable to get some of your personal perspectives on leadership in the pharmaceutical industry. We will be leaving you Brian's LinkedIn and of course his company's website if anybody's just interested in connecting with him in general. I also equally ask if you guys can like this video, share it with people you think could also enjoy, or subscribe. This is actually how we get use the algorithm so that other people can find this content. And encourage you also to check out the Impetus website. These are the kinds of conversations that when Brian was talking about collaboration, that's what the Impetus Insight platform does. It allows for that longitudinal conversation, bringing stakeholders around the table for these really big, hairy, audacious conversations around, payments and regulatory environments, and what does software as a medical device look like, and all kinds of things that are even beyond the pill that are going to help us move the needle forward in the healthcare space. And this is the aspiration of taking us beyond just the brand conversation into something that's much more substantial. So come and check us out at Impetus Digital. Thank you to all for your time and listening to us today. Thank you, Brian, for an absolutely fantastic conversation, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for the invite. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.